ready to go.
Great.
All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our chat and learn today. Whether this is your first or your 50th chat, I am so excited to welcome you and have you participate in today's conversation with our very special guest. And so, getting us kicked off today, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things. Turn your cameras on, come off of mute. I see we've got a couple people with their cameras on, so thank you for being present and being here. We really love to have engagement and participation on these conversations. I'm really just here to make sure everything goes well, and I can feed all of your questions to Jane if you type them in the chat. But I'm just really, excited when I see people writing in the chat and coming off of mute. I just want to let you know that should you come off of mute for today's conversation, you will come up in our live recording and our live streaming on YouTube just for privacy purposes. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment anonymously, please feel free to find me in the chat box and write me privately, and I will be free. I will, go ahead and ask Jane that question or make that comment. And like I said, this is being recorded, and so we'll send an email afterwards with this. So, no need to take a bunch of notes now. You can always come back and revisit this. We really just want you to be present here in the now. And then finally, keep up with us on social. You can find us at Power to Fly on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. And you can definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel where we are live streaming all of our chat and learns. So that's amazing. So you never miss a beat. And so with that, I'm so excited to introduce today's speaker, and also just super excited to listen to everything she has to say. And so Jane Garza is the managing director of NOBL. And without, getting into too much information about that, I would love her to tell us about that. Just some of the key takeaways from today's conversation are going to be talking about, the hallmarks of a healthy company culture and how can we make the change once we know what we need to evolve. And so without saying too much more, Jane, I would love to hand it off to you and have you tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, happy to. Hi, everyone. So delighted to see some faces here and excited to answer some questions. So yes, I'm the managing director of NOBL California. We're an organizational design and change consultancy. We particularly focus on making change inside organizations. So organizational designers do all sorts of things like building structures and helping with how teams work together. Our focus is going into an organization and kind of defining where are you now, where do you need to be in order to better connect your culture and your strategy, and then how do we actually get you there? How do we do the steps that help you make change and develop healthy cultures? And I work with organizations of all sizes all across the world. So, like the Warner Brothers of the world, Calvin Klein, parts of Google, parts of Airbnb. So from the fresher startups to companies that have been around for a long period of time and have had the same practices for years and years and are now looking to look at ways to change it. I actually come from the world of HR. I did that for almost a decade internally, and I did HR culture and strategy, basically helping kind of line up all of the various services that HR offers, like onboarding and recruiting, and put them towards a strategy, right? It's not just a thing that we do reactively. It's actually something that we're doing to support business strategy. And then got interested in how can I do that at many different orgs and many different cultures, which is what led me to consulting and where I am now. And I've been with NOBL for the last 3 years, kind of bouncing around from culture to culture. And I'm excited to talk with you all today with a particular focus on virtual healthy cultures. How do we make those healthy? So thanks for being here.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here. And it's just really amazing to have you talk about this, because I think so many times we understand that we need to make changes and we can feel maybe sometimes defeated because it feels like there's a lot of changes to make. And so it can be easy to feel defeated, especially now working virtually and understanding how we can make those changes. So very excited to dive into today's conversation. And so, I just want to show the pre-submitted questions that we have. And again, if this is your first conversation or your 50th, just want to remind you that, this is all about you. So please feel free to come off of mute, write in the chat, and really participate in today's conversation. And until anyone feels comfortable, coming off of mute or writing in the chat, let's get kicked off with the first pre-submitted question, Jane. So what are some ways to integrate new employees to the team and company when onboarding is entirely remote?
It's a good question. And I think one literally everyone is tackling right now, right? How do we actually help ourselves feel connected to an organization when you're brand new to it and you don't actually get to meet anyone in person or see how meetings run, where everyone sits, even simple things like that. The way that I like to think about onboarding, just to keep it kind of simple, is I sometimes overlay it against the model of like forming, storming, norming, and performing, which is an old team model of how teams kind of run and manage well together. And in that model, if you think about forming in relations to onboarding, forming is like the really simple things of just saying, hi, Nicole, like, nice to meet you. What's your background? Why are you here? Here's why I'm here. The basics of how we get to know each other, right? That's actually pretty easily done virtually. It's just setting up some one-on-ones, making sure that people are getting connected, that they're kind of generally getting to know the network of the organization. The part to really focus on is storming, which is where teams start to have disagreements, figure out how one person works and the other person works and how they're going to line up those things. It's all of the moments that we kind of have to calibrate one another in order to make sure we work well together. So I would focus all of your onboarding efforts on that specific part of the journey, right? Is how do we make that feel more human in a virtual setting? Because really, virtually, most of us aren't getting those like hallway moments to make sure we're collaborating with one another. And my recommendations would be, it's honestly usually the simple things. It's not so much the big company events and beer after work, although those are helpful too, like doing some virtual wine tastings and things like that. It's actually the things like, hey, let's spend 5 minutes before this client meeting and talk about why you're going to take them through the process in this way. And then let's spend 15 minutes after so I can ask you questions and ask, why did you say it that way? What were you hoping they would say in response to it? Why did you take it in this direction? Why did you make that decision? Just like give people the space to ask questions. All of those things don't happen virtually because we just have these structured calendars of like one meeting to the next, right? So basically blocking off and making critical time for debriefing, for calibrating together, for processing how one another is working. And in your one-on-ones with folks, taking the time to make sure that you're having that conversation of like, what's working well in terms of how we work together now? What's not? How do we adapt it? So that's where I would definitely focus. I think all of the shinier pieces when you zoom out of in an onboarding process of just like the branding, making sure they feel welcome, maybe sending them a package in the mail so that they're getting like a part of your product or what have you on their first day. All of those pieces are important too. But I think it's those little moments and the nuances that often get lost. So that's the ones I like to highlight typically.
I love that you're saying this because, I think especially now in this virtual world that we live in, for better or for worse, it's really easy to feel like, oh my gosh, we need to get through everything as fast as possible, right? And it leaves so much room for confusion because, as you're saying, we run from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. And I know I personally am like, what is the fastest way I can get through my day, do the work I have to do, and hop off of the computer? I mean, although I go and watch TV after, so I'm not much better there, but really like disengaging from everything. And so it's so important to create that space. And have you seen that, a lot of the clients that you work with are finding the space for this? Are they having difficulty finding the space for this, especially if they're switching from, being in-house to now working virtually?
Oh, everyone is struggling with it. Every single client is talking about Zoomitis and absolutely struggling with it. So you're not alone if you're feeling it. And honestly, we feel it internally at NOBL too. We're running from meeting to meeting, facilitating meetings here and there. And it's a lot. I think we're all finding that our calendars are jam-packed with Zooms, team meetings, et cetera, any way to kind of fill our time. The thing is that I forget the name of this law, but there's a law that basically says that work will fill the time that you allow it, right? So if you give it 50 minutes, it's going to fill 50 minutes. If you give it 90 minutes, it'll fill 90 minutes. That's true for how long meetings are. That's true for what's in your calendar. And so if you're not actively blocking off, you're not doing the like blocking and tackling of making sure you're protecting your time, it's just going to get bombarded. That's something I've had to learn over time. I actually think it's like a competency that we all now need to learn, is the competency of work-life balance and virtual work-life balance, of how to actually make sure that you're having time for sense making versus just doing or just discussing or making decisions in a meeting, right? We need both in order to be productive members of our workplaces. And most of us, regardless of your job, it does require some creativity. It requires some thinking, some processing, some strategy. And that's true for like literal creative fields and for folks in HR or in finance. It does require creative problem solving. So making sure that you're blocking off that time, I think, is like so critical and something we really work on with our all of the teams that we lead. Often what we recommend is like start small. Can you create some sort of new rule where, okay, starting December, if starting next week is not doable, but starting December, we're no longer going to have meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That gives time for people to calibrate their calendars. That gives time for things to shuffle around. And hopefully by then you can make strides towards getting there. If that's not possible, figure out the bite-sized version that is possible that you can try immediately and go from there. But I think just like you have to find those baby steps towards getting to more work-life balance, or else it'll always kind of eat up however much it can.
Oh my gosh, that's so true. I have recently, as of last week, I started not taking external calls on Fridays because otherwise I find myself in that space where I'm just back to back to back to back to back, and then trying to catch up with everything afterwards. And it's like, well, you never really catch up. So, I really love that actionable step of, taking these baby steps, and maybe it's also making your meetings 5 minutes shorter, right? Instead of 30 minutes, 25 minutes. But yeah, we have somebody writing in the chat that yes, Zoom fatigue is so real. I've heard the term Zoomsday recently, which I feel like should apply to Zoom across the board. While I do love Zoom and the stuff it allows us to do by connecting, it is definitely fatigue invoking.
Yeah. It's sort of like when Slack was designed, developed, and created, they didn't realize how much of an effect it would have on how we work together. The fact that it's now really easy to get in contact with anyone at any time of the day. And now Zoom has like the same responsibilities on its shoulders, right? Like you developed a program in which we can all talk to each other for every minute of the day, but there aren't any like levers in there to make sure that those hours are healthy, that we're actually finding the right balance. It would be fun if Zoom created some sort of like, okay, you only get to set 10 hours of meetings a week, and then you've like hit your max and you're not allowed to set any more meetings. But yeah, some of those practices need to be kind of built into our tech tools to make sure we don't overdo it.
I love that. And especially thinking about sometimes we need those outside forces to push us to do it, right? Because I think sometimes we just end up being overachievers, whether we want to or not, and just end up going and going and going and going. And Rebecca writes in the chat that also I see issues with whether the meetings are adding value. The traditional, could this have been an email meeting? Very true. Thank you for writing in the chat. And I also just want to shout out again, if anyone has any questions or comments and they would love to come off of mute, please feel free. Really want to make this about you. And perfect. We have a question from Carrie that says, do you think we're having a lot more meetings now?
Yes. So there's actual data in organizations at scale where they have data that's being tracked of their Zoom, their Slack, et cetera. They're finding that people are working more hours. They're working more hours outside of regular work days, and they have more meetings as a result of this change to virtual. The thing is, like, it's okay. What we often say about change is like, we're in this transitionary period, right? Like, where we all reshuffle to virtual. A lot of organizations weren't used to that. It's understandable that it's going to be a little bit messy, right? Change is always a little bit messy in the middle. The thing to learn from this is like, let's actually take this as a moment of not saying virtual work has failed. It's failing us all, right? And instead thinking about what can we do to learn from this? Let's look back at the last 6 months, see what's working well and what's not, and then start to make some adaptations to how we actually work together to learn from how we're doing it currently and make it more manageable for our people. I think that's like the critical thing to take away, is staying really conscious and thoughtful about how we work together versus letting the new way of work just kind of take over and become the norm.
For sure. I love it. I love it. I love it. Perfect. And we have another question coming in. We have the chat box really blowing up now, so I love the engagement.
Great.
But we had another question that came in from Emily that says, how can we best support our team through the stress and the potential aftermath of the election in ways that are nonpartisan, caring, and realistic?
What a good question. So it probably depends on your organization, your level of conversation now around these topics. Like, is this brand new? Is it something that you talk about pretty comfortably? Or maybe at a team level, right? Like, what does this look like now would be my first question. Second question is, what are people asking for? Are they asking for time to debrief? Are they asking for time away from the news cycle, which could be the reality too? And then the third thought is like, yeah, are there some practical solves that you can put in place? Our company is just taking the day off, honestly, regardless of the result of the election. We've kind of decided that it's going to be a hard day to have focus, right? So we're going to try to shut down and make sure that we don't have any client sessions that day. I think I would go into it with the assumption that people are going to be distracted and they're going to have a lot of different reactions, and allowing for those different reactions and different realities is really important, rather than saying you must feel one way or you must join this like debrief session and work with us in that debrief session a specific kind of way. I would give like multiple paths depending on what people are asking for.
And I love what you're saying, because I feel like one of the biggest things that 2020 has really taught us or pushed us to think about more is our consciousness of those around us, right? And understanding that people are living different realities, whether it's in the same country as you or abroad. What has the pandemic looked like in a different place than you, even a different state maybe, or a different province, and really being more thoughtful about the fact that people have, emotional burdens, and they have families at home, and they're also trying to balance homeschooling or taking care of elderly family members, or they're dealing with other things that are just really heavy that do end up translating into work, right? Like I think I felt like we've built in society this kind of separation of professional versus the personal, right? And really they come together. You can't have the professional without the personal.
Yeah. It's so true. I mean, there's this article that's been going around from Coinbase, if folks here are familiar with it, about the founder talking about how they're going to keep politics separate from the workplace. The thing about that is that it's not like sports, right? We can't really opt out, especially if you're living in the US, and it is affecting people. And so it's hard to say like this is just completely something we're not going to talk about, because ultimately it is affecting people's day to day. It's affecting how they think about it. And I'm always really curious, what do you mean when you say no politics? Like what falls into the bucket of politics for you? Is it people's place in society? Because that's often lately, that's how we talk about politics quite a bit, right? Black Lives Matter is for some reason kind of looped in with politics versus being a human problem. And how does that actually show up in the day-to-day? So that's something that I would think critically about and be careful about kind of stifling those conversations, and instead create spaces that are the right places for each of those conversations, so that that energy goes somewhere, those conversations go somewhere.
Love it. Oh, I love what you said, and I love that. And I see Jan shaking her head, and so I can tell she's agreeing with everything that you're saying. And thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate it. And so we had a couple other questions that came in the chat. So Megan asks, so if we try to set up no meetings on a certain day, what tips or tricks do you suggest when we are not holding ourselves accountable to it? How can we recalibrate?
Not holding yourselves accountable to the new rule. Great question. So with change, it's sort of like, imagine yourself like learning a new skill. Like you're going to learn to play tennis, right? And imagine you start to learn to play and you mess up a couple times and you just kind of like throw your racket down. You're like, it's never going to work. That's what often happens in organizations, is we try something and then it doesn't work. And then we kind of give up, because it's hard to organize many people around a new type of behavior. So what we always say is like, one, start small, start with something that is achievable, that you can get done, because it's like dumb simple. Like next week we can absolutely do this. It's going to be really easy. We'll just try it with one meeting. That's my very first, and like the first advice I always go to with all leaders. The second thing is, once you've done that and found that win, parade it around and celebrate it as loudly, like beat that drum, and then move on to the second stage. So start with really small baby steps. And if those baby steps feel obvious, it doesn't matter, because they're not being taken now inside your organization, right? So if the baby step is, we now have agendas for meetings, well, we should have always had agendas. It doesn't matter, because you don't. And so that is a baby step, and it is a piece of progress for you, right? Regardless of how you compare yourself against kind of best practices. So then once you have that, celebrate those wins, start to build off of momentum, and then show people what's working well and go from there. Maybe if no meetings across the company doesn't work immediately, try no meetings for one team, try just the marketing team, or try one pocket of the marketing team, and then start to kind of expand and go from there and let it grow kind of naturally. So the way we always think about change is like, it's really a movement more than a mandate. How can you create a movement inside your organization versus creating a rule that's kind of passed down from person to person that you have to hold people accountable to?
You're reminding me so much of this article that I recently read about the 1% rule, which I imagine that you're familiar with, about, how 1% progress over an amount of time equates to a large amount of progress, even though in the day to day it doesn't feel like that. And so that's exactly what you're reminding me of right now, talking about it. And so we had another question come in the chat from Rachel that asks, what are your top tips for making virtual meetings as effective and productive as possible?
Great question. So tip number one, the thing we always go to is every meeting should have one purpose. And that purpose can't be discussion. It has to be more specific. So are you going into that meeting to make a decision? Are you brainstorming? Are you doing some sensing, maybe listening to what your customers are saying and you want to build in those learnings into your next round of product? What is the specific purpose of that meeting? And really focus in on the one thing that you want to accomplish. And really, like, especially in a virtual setting, everything takes longer. So assume that in the amount of about 45 minutes, you can get one thing done. That's what I would aim for. We can get one really good thing done in 45 minutes. That's how we think as facilitators whenever we're blocking out kind of a workshop day. And I say 45 because even if you're booking it for 60, there's like the opening, the closing, the setting the context, all of those things. And then you get 45 minutes of real work time, right? So that's the very first thing. And it's hard, but I would start practicing it immediately with some of your meetings. In most organizations that we go into, their meetings kind of just span decision-making, brainstorming, discussion. And then it just feels a little bit like a swirl, right? We don't actually know what the focus is or what we're trying to drive towards. And so it takes up a lot of time. And then by the end of the meeting, we're kind of like, what did we do? Did we accomplish something? What decision did we make? What happens next? So that's number one. Number two is it's really helpful to have a facilitator. It doesn't have to be a trained facilitator. It just needs to be someone who's owning the fact that the meeting needs to have progress and has purpose, and is owning time, is able to say, okay, we're 30 minutes in. Do we feel like we're getting closer? What do we want to do with our last 30 minutes? And then the third thing is back to, kind of work filling the time that you give it. I always ask clients to change their meetings to 50 minutes or 25 minutes. Having our meetings be 60 minutes means that they're always going to run into each other. There's no way that they won't. And people don't get actual real breaks to like go get water, take a break from a meeting. And so that's the other thing, is just like give people the time to have a little bit of energy for your meeting by making your meeting a little bit shorter so that they have a break between each one.
I love it. Thank you so much for all the advice. And I think what I appreciate most about this conversation is that you're providing actionable steps and saying these are the things that you should do and how they work. So really appreciate that, because we have so many conversations about the theories of things and never get to the meat and peas about what we really need to be doing. So super appreciative of you, Jane, for being here and sharing all that.
Of course.
And so moving on to this question, this pre-submitted question, is it at all possible for an entry-level employee to shape company culture?
It's a great question. So my first reaction to this question is almost protective, because I've been in this position, entry level, and trying to shape culture. Yes, it's possible. It is possible. At the same time, it's hard. It's pushing a boulder uphill, and it takes time and energy. And I say conserve and choose where you're putting your optimism wisely, right? If people are giving you the signal that they're not going to change, and you don't have a whole lot of power in order to change their incentives or help them change, it can feel really exhausting and draining to continue to try to push for that change. That's my first caveat. And that's often some of the advice that I give to people when I'm coaching them, right? Is be really smart about where you're using your energy. It doesn't mean don't try it. It means think about what's the focus thing that you want to see be different in 30 days and get really specific about that. Second thing is, yes, and if you're going to go down this path, have a specific thing in mind. So what do you want to see change in your company culture? How do you see that changing? If you had to put yourself in the mindset of literally, okay, it's January 2021, we've succeeded, we're in an excellent culture, I've seen the changes that I really want to see different. What is it that you see that looks different? Is it difference in how leaders lead? Is it difference in how they support their entry level people and how much professional development happens? What specifically do you want to see change? And then basically I would recommend bringing a proposal to wherever you need to bring it to get it approved. So this is just like the practice of managing up, right? Is laying out all of the steps and the options, and then giving it to someone and being like, look, I did all the work. Here's what I think needs to happen. And here's by when I think it needs to happen. Here are the pros and cons, any objections, and then try to push it forward that way. But yeah, just be mindful of your own energy. I think this is often how people get burnt out, right? So you have to have a bit of a A/B plan of like, I'm comfortable pushing hard for a year, and then if in a year I still feel like this culture is draining me, I'm ready to exit and move somewhere else. So.
And it can probably be also hard being an entry level employee if you feel like you have to go against what's already been set as a standard, right? And especially if you're working at a smaller company, how can you do that without stepping on toes and offending the founders, because they might feel attacked at the fact that you think that there's changes that need to be made in the company culture.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're one of these people in the audience, please contact me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to just be a coach for all of these conversations. It's also just very nuanced, right? It's like specific to your point. Depends on what your founders are like, depends on what your culture is like. I'm here. So feel free to tap me for those questions.
I love it. And we will include your LinkedIn in the follow-up email so everyone can get in contact with you. Perfect. And so we had another question that came into the chat from Aaron that says, how do you best evaluate a company culture prior to accepting an offer at a company? I've tried getting to know existing employees, but that doesn't always help me how I understand how I will fit in the culture.
Okay. I like what Amanda said. So one, right, what's the culture add versus culture fit, right? When we're hiring, when we're helping our clients hire, we're always thinking about, we don't want to hire proxies of ourselves. We don't want to just hire, it's not a duplication model. Instead, we want to hire in people who have fresh opinions and smarts and can build on what we're already doing and make us even stronger, even better. So that's the first thing, is like, what are you bringing to it? And don't let that be pushed to the side, Aaron. The second piece is, one of my favorite questions to ask when you're evaluating company culture is, what gives people culture shock here? Like when you joined, what gave you culture shock? What gave some other new hires culture shock? It's not meant to be like a gotcha question. It's more just like, help me understand what people are usually surprised by 30 days in or 90 days in. And then the last piece is, know that every company culture has its trade-offs. Every single culture and every single company journey, let's say, has its trade-offs, right? So if you're in a startup, you're likely saying yes to the excitement of being able to build a company, being able to be part of the strategy and what happens next. But you're also saying yes to a lack of creature comforts, a lack of consistency, a lot of uncertainty. And some people really like that. I'm at a startup. I like that. I think it's fun to be able to be part of this, but not everyone likes that. So it's like knowing what are the trade-offs? What are you balancing, and what are you okay with being not so great versus you need to make sure you have this hands down. So right now, let's say, as you're looking for opportunities, almost everyone is virtual, but a lot of organizations are going to go back to this half and half model or a full-time in-office model. I think that's probably a big one for folks, is like, oh, actually, I want to be somewhere where I will eventually work with people in an office again. I like that. I need that collaboration. Or I want to be somewhere where I have a lot of the flexibility to work from home. I want to be somewhere where I'm empowered and I can make decisions. Or I want to be somewhere where I'm part of a team and I'm kind of like a subject matter expert and I help them on a specific role, but I'm not there to do strategy. So just thinking through, like, what's the level that you want to sit at? How much encouragement or empowerment do you need from an organization? What kind of leader do you want to work with? It's all of those trade-offs and really lining them up for yourself, and knowing that every single organization does definitely have its negatives. It's just kind of being able to balance what's a negative for you that's a no-go.
I love all of your advice. It's just so insightful, and it makes you say, like, duh, these things are so important, but it's just so much easier when you have somebody from the outside saying, like, this is what you should do. This is what you should look for. So thank you. And we have another question in the chat that asks, since Jane also has rich experience in recruiting and onboarding, I have this question: how to demonstrate the alignment with the company's culture when applying for an opening at this company or during the interviews? What questions will the recruiters ask at this point?
Good question. Alignment with their company culture. I think, well, one thing is you need to get to know them pretty well and what they're looking for. For me, so kind of like what I was saying in the last question, the next organization that I might interview for, I'm looking for an organization that's not looking for culture fit. I want to be a culture ad. And I think it would disappoint me if they were just looking for culture fit, right? If they were just like, line up with what we've already got, or else you're out of here. So it's kind of figuring out like what are you okay with in terms of what they're looking for, and look at it as a two-way process versus a one-way process. It's not so much about you demonstrating alignment with the organization, but you each demonstrating alignment with one another, right? What are they doing for you and what are you doing for them? And what are the questions that would help you understand that? Maybe what are your work values, the way that you like to lead people, or the way that you like to work with others? I would kind of like literally write out, here's what I appreciate. Often we think a lot of those things are obvious, but they're only obvious to us. For example, I like to make ideas with other people. I'm not a big like solo thinker. I like to brainstorm and collaborate with others. I know other people who like to like hole away for an hour, build the thing, and then like unveil it and then get feedback on it. For ourselves, all of those things honestly seem obvious, but it just helps to write down what's your style, what do you like, what do you want to appreciate about the next organization you work at, and then start to ask questions that would help you get a clue into that. How do people typically work at this place? If you could tell me the story of how a product was first ideated to like went to market, tell me that story so you can hear like step by step, where did that actually happen, and who collaborated on it, that kind of thing. I would just try to help people get practical about like, tell me the story of how things work here, how work gets done, how people make decisions, etc.
Awesome advice. Thank you, Jane.
Mm-hmm.
And so moving on to the next question, what are some ideas to further foster culture initiatives and celebrations in your existing interactions? I'm wary of adding new meetings or chats when people are already overbooked.
It's a great one. So a couple ideas. So one is my brain goes to, what are people asking for? What do people want to see? So I would first ask, maybe to do a quick survey or something more informal if you just want to do it via Slack, and just say like, what ideas do you have? What kind of connections would you like to see from one another? That can help you get to know our latest new hires or feel more connected to our strategy or what have you. I think it always really helps to have some end goal that you're trying to hit with any of these like cultural initiatives, right? So it's not just for the fun of it, but there is some connection to what we're doing as an organization and what we're trying to accomplish together. Although fun things are fun too, but I think you just want a good balance of like connecting one another to strategy, or connecting one another to new hires, things like that. The other thing is, if people are overbooked, the idea I had is like, maybe you can just have a fun session where you're killing meetings. Join us for 60 minutes and we're going to look at this list of meetings because we're all overbooked. And instead of adding a new thing to our plate, we're actually going to spend time deciding which of these meetings we can kill and kind of like send off and say goodbye to. So try to balance the overbooking with what you're trying to accomplish here too, so that you're not adding a new meeting to someone's plate. And especially like, I think these days we're also much more aware of, Nicole, to your point, like we're more aware of everyone's different position. We're especially more aware of parents at home, right? Like right now, not everyone has care. Not every school is officially open. Like my next door neighbor actually has 3 boys, 3 different classrooms, working throughout the house, 3 different virtual settings, in addition to 2 offices from each of the parents. So just kind of understanding that not everyone wants to spend the extra hour at the end of the workday to do like a happy hour, and instead maybe tie it in with something that you're trying to accomplish together, but make it fun. Do it with some stickies, do it via Miro, make it a little bit more fluid and flexible, do some brainstorming exercises at the beginning, that kind of thing.
I really love that advice, and I love the idea of getting together and scratching meetings that aren't working. That's an awesome idea. And I wanted to add you a question here. Oh, I wanted to add, this is also an interesting point, right? Because especially if you're working with a global team, you have people who are celebrating different holidays around, different times of the year, whether you have team members in India or in Latin America or in Canada. We all have different customs and traditions that we can also kind of bring to the table, and maybe some of these fun, if you want to add that, but getting to share these things.
For sure. Yeah.
and it's really fun to get to learn about the different cultures and customs that people have, especially Power to Flies. We're globally diverse. It's so cool getting to learn about, I don't know, the Holi festival in India, and getting to see pictures of people celebrating those things. It's a lot of fun. And I want to ask everyone on the line, what is your favorite thing that you've learned from your coworkers that are dispersed globally? If you have globally dispersed, if not, maybe it's somebody in a different part of the United States. I know, like in Chicago for St. Patrick's Day, I think they dye the whole river green. And so I would just love to see that, see what kind of global stuff we have going on.
Yeah.
All
While people are
right. And
adding
so,
things to the chat, you bring up a good point too about like, let it be asynchronous sometimes. Fun doesn't have to be all of us online at the same time in a happy hour. It could be, okay, for all of tomorrow, we're going to spend the day each posting like photos of our pets. And that's just like, it's going to be pet photo day. And it's just a fun way to connect one another, right? And it's simple, it's easy. You could do it between meetings, but it still makes you feel like you know a little bit more about the people that you're working with than just what you see in meetings. And then the other thing is make it opt-in. I've heard a couple of leaders say like, oh, we did a happy hour when people didn't turn on their cameras and that it was kind of annoying. And I get it. Like, I think you want everyone to be a part of it and you want them to be involved. But at the same time, there's so much going on and not everyone wants to be on Zoom for another hour. And so just like pick your moments smartly when you actually want to make sure that it's enforced that cameras are on versus opt-in, and letting people kind of be flexible in terms of how they want to engage in the fun things, right? That's when the forced fun really becomes forced, when you push it too hard.
And you can feel when it's forced. It's never, like Amanda's saying, it's never a good strategy, and it is never fun. It ends up being like really kind of awkward at that point, because you're like, oh, I have to stay here because I don't know if I can leave. Yes, that's a fantastic point. And so what behaviors should leaders model and encourage to ensure everyone on their team has an equitable amount of visibility and opportunity to be heard in virtual meetings?
Great question. This is something we work on a lot with our clients. So the first thing, if you're not familiar with it, the first thing I would start to look up is psychological safety in meetings. Psychological safety is this concept that was developed by Amy Edmondson and then was more popularized by a Google study about what makes high performing teams. They basically were just trying to figure out like, what's the recipe? And the recipe, it was 5 characteristics, but the very first characteristic is psychological safety, which when you hear the term can be a little bit misleading. Psychological often sounds like individual, my safety, but it's actually about a shared belief. So it's the shared belief that we as a group, let's say this virtual group right here, is comfortable taking interpersonal risks. So we're all comfortable kind of raising risky ideas, voicing our opinions, voicing some dissent when it needs to be voiced. And there's a difference between safety and comfort, right? It's not that we're like really comfy and we can say whatever we want. It's that there's a safety and there's a safety net, but it doesn't mean that you won't fall a couple times. And that's okay too. So that's the first thing I think about is like, how do we foster that psychological safety? Not necessarily just comfort of anyone saying whatever they want, whenever they want, or I'm the CEO, I feel psychologically safe, but no one else does. But instead, how do we create that psychological safety of everyone feeling it? The way that you can foster it as a leader, especially in meetings, a couple things. So one is setting the expectation that you actually want everyone's input. Just literally saying it out loud is really helpful. Saying that that's the way that you like to work, that that's the way that you want to operate your meetings. The second is actually setting up moments for that. So the way that we often run our meetings is we'll do them in rounds, right? So we're going to do a reaction round. And then literally I'll be like, Nicole, what do you think about that thing? Any reactions? One sentence, what's top of mind for you? Okay, Martin, your turn. What's top of mind for you? And making sure that when we're first building the behavior and we're not noticing that not everyone is speaking up or we're getting kind of the same voices over and over again, we have to play the role of facilitator and as leader to make sure that we're creating those shared and equal voices from the beginning. And it's kind of setting that expectation. It takes a second to build the muscle, but once people are more comfortable with it, they'll get into it too. Obviously, don't put people on the spot. Like, I wouldn't be like, Nicole, you've been really quiet. What's wrong? But instead, call people in, help them feel comfortable being a part of the conversation, make them feel like their opinion is really valued and wants to be heard. And then I think the third thing that's important is modeling some fallibility. As a leader, being able to say, I'm not sure here. What would be a good rough draft? Where do you guys think we should start? Like just modeling a little bit of uncertainty, fallibility, the openness to have rough drafts and not have everything be perfected. in a lot of organizations we work in, they're kind of like stuck in the treadmill of building these 30-page decks to get their strategy reports out, right? And that is really all about the opposite of psychological safety. It's such a risk-averse environment that over the years, we've built up this habit of like perfecting everything, taking weeks and weeks of preparation for just a simple presentation meeting. Instead of taking those weeks of time to actually build the thing, do the thing, we're like taking that time to plan the thing. So those would be probably my top 3 pieces of advice there.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question here. So for somebody, let me go back. So when I listen to you talk about this, it reminds me, or it makes me feel like this would work best in a small organization, right? Where there's not too many people. But say you're in a larger organization, and you are also underrepresented or minority. What does that look like? Is there a way that in this virtual world we can maintain some anonymity for those people who might not feel comfortable just yet? Maybe there hasn't been this culture of psychological safety. How can, you talked about how we can change that moving forward, but how can we kind of try to fix what's already been instilled?
Yeah. So we actually do a lot of these practices with really large organizations, but we recommend that their meetings are still small, right? You don't really need 30-person meetings. I don't know when that's ever helpful, unless it's a town hall and it's like, we're reporting out versus collaborating. But in your smaller meetings, what we often do from a facilitation point of view, especially for just building this habit, is we'll do a round of, so we'll start with a check-in round. A check-in is like a really simple practice that we use to kick off a meeting to start to build that psychological safety. And it's literally just answering the question of like, what are you bringing with you? What could be taking up some mental real estate or distracting you from the meeting today? We did a bit of that when we started Nicole today, just like naturally, we were talking about our days. But we do that with everyone in the meeting. So Nicole, what are you bringing? Jan, what are you bringing? Martin, what are you bringing? And then we'll do a round of, let's say we're about to review some strategy proposals. We'll do a round of just reading. Okay, 5 minutes for everyone to just like remember what's in this document and be ready to talk about it. And then we'll do in the reaction round, if folks don't feel comfortable immediately sharing, and we know that as facilitators just in this culture, we'll do a silent round of reaction. So in the Teams chat or in the Zoom chat or in the Miro board, Miro is a virtual whiteboard tool that we often use to facilitate our meetings. Add your reaction to the Miro board. And then we'll just have people like +1 a reaction that you've enjoyed. So there's definitely some various practices that you can use to kind of make this comfortable for all sorts of people. I think the key is switching it up quite often, having these various paths and being thoughtful about everyone being kind of varied in how they want to participate.
I love it. Thank you so much, Jane. And we had another question that came in the chat. And so how do you protect yourself from burnout and resenting forced fun? You can't not resent forced fun because it's forced, but that's my input there. The person writes, I'm a solo HR person at our company, and so a lot of the cheerleading and culture leadership falls on my shoulders. And if we don't get a lot of if we don't get a lot of opt-in on events, the company owners hold me accountable. I'm not sure how to maintain my enthusiasm for these activities.
That's hard. I feel you. So burnout is it's actually all about like, how do I build my own resilience, right? In order to not feel that burnout quite as much. It's tough because we're in a year of burnout. There's a lot of things that can make you potentially feel burnt out. So it's understandable that you're feeling that. Time away from work, time away from Slack, probably advice number 1. Number 2 is reflective moments. So actually being able to have the processing time, the sense making time that Nicole and I talked about at the beginning of the session, where at the end of the week, you just like reflect on, here's what I did this week. Here's what I think worked well. Here's what I think I'd like to improve, and then go on to the next week. That like coaching sense making time is actually really good for your brain, and just like resetting from the week, being able to kind of bookmark the week, put it off to the side, and then enjoy your weekend. Those would be probably my 2 biggest inputs, but also there's probably so much out there from a mental health perspective. That's not my particular area of focus, but there are a lot of incredible, intelligent folks who are pushing that forward and figuring out how to make work-life balance and burnout less of a thing inside organizations. What was the other part of that question? It was about, how to encourage participation. Yeah. So encouraging participation in company-wide meetings it's all about expectation. So really setting the expectations that is actually what you want from your meetings. Often the way that organizations go about it is they do like a Q&A. That's still kind of one-sided, right? Like people are inputting questions, but it doesn't feel super comfortable to raise your hand and ask that risky question to the CEO. What you can do is find some cultural champions, some people who are comfortable, have them be your starting pocket of people, help them prep some questions so that you know what they're going to ask, and then actually just like plant them basically for the first one and get your champions going to model the behavior. The other thing you can do is make the all hands itself feel less formal, maybe by having the CEO or the executives that are going to be leading it have more of like a panel discussion or a conversational discussion versus like a presentation that they're walking through step by step, right? So make it a little bit more informal. The key there is just like, how do you make it more human, more conversational, and less scary to ask those questions? Because that's usually where that hesitation is coming from, is people feel like, I could ask it, but they're going to remember forever that I was the one who asked it, and I'm maybe going to get in trouble for this a month from now because it was a risky question.
Totally. And one thing that I can think about here, and going back to what you said before, but if there's the flexibility to do it, also ask what people want. You know, I'm always surprised to see how great an idea I think I have, and then the rest of the people are like, that's not the best idea, and that's not really what I want to do. And as disappointing as it is, you know, market research, no matter how small your market is in this opportunity, you know, focusing on that. All right, so thank you for all of your questions, and thank you for all of the engagement in the chat. I'm really, really loving it, and I just want to, you know, shout out if anyone has any other questions or they want to come off of mute, please feel free to do so. All right, and so going to the next one, what have been some of the biggest mistakes or pitfalls companies have made in the past couple of months to try and create a positive remote culture? Basically, what should we not do?
Two things probably. So one is a lot of people tried to just recreate their existing culture in a virtual setting, which is not really possible. We can't create the same exact environment. We kind of have to rebuild from the ground up. I think the biggest thing I would say here is stay purposeful, not accidental about your culture. Don't let the meetings themselves kind of take over and become your culture. Stay purposeful about what do you want your employees' weeks to look like? If you had to kind of split up the pie chart and say, okay, our marketing team, I would ideally like them to be spending 1/4 of that pie chart doing some ideating, and then the other fourth doing some customer sensing, and the other fourth doing this. How do we help encourage that? So going backwards now, knowing that that's where you want people's time to be spent or their attention to be spent, how do we help actually encourage that through our rhythms, our rituals, the way that we behave together, the things that we talk about, the pieces that we highlight in our company all hands, all of those pieces. So that's probably number one. I think the other thing we talked about at the top of this call, but use this as a learning moment, right? We're all, some of us are doing it well, some of us are doing it poorly, but we're all learning how to work virtually for the first time. So how can you use this as a moment to kind of do a retrospective on and get together a collective of some employees and literally ask the questions of, what's working for you about how we're working right now in a virtual setting? What's not working for you? What would you change? What would you like to see by January? What would you like to see tomorrow? So that you can kind of build a plan and then pick like 2 things to try. Don't make a list and then get lost in trying to make that whole list work. Start small, start bite size, and do incremental change versus like full-fledged unveiling of new change.
I love it. And I think it's just a timeless advice to start small, right? I think it applies to so many things in our lives, but going back to what you said before about, you know, it's so easy to get discouraged and so many people give up right away just because you're not seeing improvements, but maybe it's just that you're taking on way too much at once.
Yeah. And there's a great change researcher, Rosabeth Cantor, who talks about everything looking like failure in the middle. Right? We're in the middle. It looks like failure because we haven't quite settled. And the other thing is there's a great book, I think that came out in the 90s around change. And really what it talks about is that change is a 3-step process, whereas we often think about it as a 2-step process. We switch the light on, it's changed. When really there's an ending, there's a transition period, and then there's a beginning. And a lot of people are still in the ending transition period. We're still kind of mourning the loss of our last way of working, kind of figuring out how to adapt. We haven't gotten to like the new celebratory moment of this is how we are yet. And in order to get there, we have to do a bit of learning and figure out how do we want to be versus just kind of falling into it and realizing a year down the road, oh no, we're still in 50 hours of meetings every week and we haven't kind of adapted how we actually work together.
Yes, I love it. I love it. And so we had a question that came in from Aaron that asked, what's the best way to navigate a toxic culture?
So we have a podcast that we do at NOBL Collective where we look at pop culture, so movies, TV, and then we look at the organizations inside that pop culture, like the Men in Black organization, for example, and we basically dissect it the way organizational designers do, but we're allowed to like talk very freely because we're not talking about a specific client or a real life person. So we've actually talked about this question quite a bit, is toxic cultures from that perspective, if that's interesting for you to pop into. But the thing that I go back to is when thinking about navigating changing culture as an entry-level employee, I have the same kind of reaction to toxic cultures, right? You have to decide for yourself what your career trajectory is, what the organization's change trajectory is, and whether or not those are actually going to line up. And at one point you decide to actually exit because it's not lining up. I know so many people who have been burnt out by toxic culture in the hopes that it would change, and then eventually saw that it didn't. That's step number one, is just like, take care of yourself, right? Humans more important than work, right? I believe in really meaningful work, but at the end of the day, it is work. And we want to make sure that the humans that do it are safe and healthy. In terms of navigating it, it kind of depends on what makes it toxic. Is it that it's overly competitive? Is it that it's very sexist? Like, what is it specifically? And I think there are many different paths. When it comes to like the really critical toxic pieces, the things that you would get involved with HR around, the biggest advice is document everything and then talk to like 3 different paths. Talk to HR, talk to your manager, and talk to another manager, and make sure that you're voicing this opinion quite as often as possible, basically. If that's something you're comfortable with doing, of course, but that's usually the best way to make sure that change is made, is like this surround sound of, here's the problem that I'm seeing not change time and time again, but document everything to protect yourself, make sure that you're keeping track of what's happening. And then the last piece is, if you're a leader, I think it's, or if you want to make the change, it's finding your champions, finding the people, a group of people who want the change as well, and starting to build a bit of a groundswell, going back to that like movements, not mandates. Thinking around change is, how do we build the movement? Who are my people who will help me do that and actually like help me make strides towards change over time?
I love it. And there is almost nothing as powerful as documenting everything that you're going through and making sure that you have a record of what you're talking about. So if you decide to have that conversation, you have everything written down to back up what you're saying. So thank you for that advice. And then somebody else writes, what if you do that over and over again and nothing changes, and you were advised to change your perspective about the situation that is so clearly toxic?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, at a certain point, you can't change people's behavior, right? You can help them see where their behavior is flawed. You can help them see paths to changing it, but you have a limited amount of influence or control over what other people do. And so that's what I mean when I say like line up your own trajectory against the company's. Is it time to leave? It could be. If you're getting the same message over and over again and you feel like it's toxic, it could be time to leave. I think that might be the safest thing safest bet for you in protecting yourself.
And so I have a follow-up question here for you, Jane. So if you're in this type of culture and you're feeling like it's really toxic, and let's say you honestly just started. So first part of my question is, 1, how long should you wait it out? And 2, let's say it is very toxic and you can't make it to a year. I'm just putting a time amount out there, but I'm interested to see what you have to say. But let's say you can't make it to that time. How do you go about explaining that to a next employer without, navigating that conversation without feeling like you're bashing the previous company, organization, to not make yourself look bad?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and to be fair to your point, Nicole, like you don't always have the ability to leave, right? Like everyone's situation varies, and so sometimes there's not that opportunity, which is totally understandable. I think if that's the case, And in any case, basically what you want to look for is like incentives and power structures. Where are the informal or formal incentives or power structures that you can have influence over to make change? To your second question around how to have this conversation, if you do exit and you're not at a company for a full year, I'm a big believer in, now look, everyone recruits differently. And so everyone has different opinions and sometimes doesn't agree with this, but I'm a big believer in it actually like doesn't matter so much what your resume says, it's the story that you tell around it. So if you're able to tell me the story of what you learned and picked up at every stage of the way, I'm better able to understand your decisions. It's really hard to actually understand that from just a resume. And I think when people use these like gut rules on resumes to make decisions, that's where bias starts to play in. That's where we start to make really discriminatory decisions and are most likely to hire less diverse people. Using these kind of like simplified rules doesn't account for all of the nuance that actually happens in all of our careers over time. Having been a recruiter for years in my HR role, I can tell you that like 90% of people do career switches, change their careers halfway through their time in the workforce. But for some reason, we're often led to believe that like everyone has this really consistent, I spend 2 years here, then I leveled up, then I spent 2 years here, et cetera. That's not really the case. Really, it's all about how you tell that story and how much you're able to kind of pull the red thread along with it so that people can understand what you learned and what you took away from each step of the way.
I love it. I love it. So we have, just about 3-4 minutes left. And so I want to, round us off here with two things. One, I love your focus on, work is really second, we're really first, because realistically, we can't have a job if we are not well. And so, mentally, physically, and all that entails. What's your favorite way to decompress? How do you, turn the notch back and relax if you can? And then two, what takeaways would you like people to take from today's conversation?
Ooh, okay. Favorite way to decompress lately. This is going to be funny because I don't know how familiar or how broad this has gone, but there's a new like community around jump rope and in particular jump rope tricks. It's really fascinating. I highly recommend looking it up. There are a bunch of new like influencers on Instagram, but it's just a fun way to work out and try some new things. I'm a big like puzzle solver in my workouts. I used to do a lot of rock climbing, which is not super doable with COVID. So this is my new fun way to kind of reset and also just like shake my body after sitting in front of a Zoom all day. In terms of takeaways, number one thing is that change is incremental, right? So don't feel down if at any point in making change, you feel like, oh no, we've hit our first failure or things are falling apart. It's honestly all a part of the journey. It's just like learning any skill. You're just kind of halfway through it and you haven't hit the celebratory point. So it's okay. You're just along that journey. The other thing is, I think around just like taking care of yourself and taking care of the people around you. I think, Nicole, what you said is absolutely true, that I really hope that what we take away from 2020 is this new empathy for how we all are coming to work and what everyone is experiencing outside of work, and balancing all of that together and making sure that we're being mindful of all of that together and how we engage and how we have teamwork, how we make decisions, all of those things. So.
I absolutely love it, Jane. This has been such a fantastic conversation. I know I've taken a lot away from it, and you are just such a fantastic speaker. You are so logical and methodical in the way that you speak. So I really appreciated being on this conversation with you. And so I want to thank you for being here, for taking the time out of your day to instill your insight and knowledge upon our community. And I want to thank everyone for being on the line today and for being a part of this conversation in the middle of a very interesting year. And I hope that everyone has a non-2020 day, and it is almost Friday. So we're almost at the weekend, and I hope you have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Thank you for your energy and your very insightful connections and questions. And thanks everyone else. I really appreciated it. These questions were incredible. And like I said, tap me on LinkedIn if I can be helpful in any other ways.